Discord. And welcome, Laura, to join us.
Thanks, Serena. Welcome everyone to this session on equipping funders in systems change. So we have an hour together today. Lovely to see some familiar faces and also some new faces in here today. We are going to spend the first sort of 10-15 minutes introducing the School of System Change and the curriculum that we developed for a program called Investors in Change, which was co-initiated with Catalyst 2030 and also some other partners. So we'll get to hear about where that idea came from and a 3-module pilot that we ran last year and some of the learning from that. But we'd also like to pull out some discussion questions, and we might set up some little breakout rooms just so that we can have a sort of more intimate discussion around some of the key questions and learnings that we have brought out of this program. And so that will kind of take us to the end of the hour once we have a bit of a plenary discussion. So I do know some of you are just kind of listening in today. So that means that we might get a bit of time back from you after the first 15 minutes or so. We wanted to make this really an interactive discussion, hear from us all about what we're learning about funders, learning and systems change. So first of all, just a few words about the school. The School of System Change is an international initiative. We are have been kind of nurtured by Forum for the Future, which is an NGO working outside of New York, London, Singapore and Mumbai on really kind of pressing global issues. And we're sort of the learning arm of this organization, but we operate as a network and we try to support people from across sectors and across themes and across professional backgrounds to really pool skills and resources and work together to create systems change. And when we talk about systems change, we like to say that it's both an outcome, so something that we're working towards, and a process, a way that we might get there that is systemic, and also a practice, something that we need to do every day and that we need to continue throughout our lives, throughout our professional spaces that we're in, you know, continue to deepen and learn. And so we're really into very social learning, learning from each other and continuing to kind of develop each other's practice. And we came to this idea of working with funders because we were realizing through our work with lots of other practitioners in the field, and you can see some of them here, that actually there was almost a leverage point, to use some system speak, that there was something that was going on in the wider system of change makers, which meant that there was a need to offer up some of the tools and frameworks that the field of systems change brings together, and that we in the school curate into our learning journeys, specifically for funders who are starting to shift from thinking about funding systems change to thinking about what the process and practice of systems change actually meant to them. And so we got together with Catalyst 2030, with Ashoka, with the Illuminate Network, and with some other funders who have been really pioneering what it means to take a systems approach and applying our principles around social learning, around looking at, you know, responding to really the context and need as things evolve. So a very much an experimental and a co-design approach. And we put together this program we called Investors in Change, which we piloted last year. So this is based on a set of systems practices and how we apply these in different processes, different parts of what we're doing in our work. And we use this kind of capacity framework and this sort of wheel of practices across all of our programs. But when we started thinking about how do we tailor this towards what funders needed, one of the things that we really got some impact in, sort of some insight into, was that there was really this question around systems diagnosis. What do we mean by systems change? What does it mean to fund in a complex world? That there was something around strategy design, but specifically for funders, which is how do we design system change funding initiatives? And there was also something really around not so much leadership and learning, but learning and impact, or learning and monitoring and evaluation, which, as we know, is a very live theme. So we start from this much wider piece and we say, okay, how can we tailor this and really kind of use our underpinning curriculum to do something that is specific to the world of funders? This gave us 3 modules, and we had a really great time bringing in multiple tools, multiple practitioners, and you can see the yellow blobs here are like the different organizations and practices that we were bringing in as we took this group of people through their funder learning journey. So there was something around what it means to work with complexity. How might we try and do funding in a different paradigm, recognizing that actually a lot of the practices in the funding world are not necessarily systemic. So we were thinking about what are the deep mindsets and mental models that have designed the way that this system operates at the moment. And we were learning about how we can diagnose a system, how we can understand the complexities and the interconnections, but very much with a practitioner view. So actually really hearing what this means in practice, and some of the honest and hard conversations in this fishbowl conversation we had last year about, how do we go on this journey? Where do different organizations start? What does it mean for their governance structures? What does it mean for their relationships with the grantees? What does it mean for even their geographical base in terms of shifting their teams to work actually in the countries where their funding was going for international development funding, for example? And so we sort of really got into what it meant to apply a systems lens, I might say, or a sort of complexity worldview to the funding sort of system itself. And then we were talking more about what strategies might funders use to really support more systems change initiatives and more systems change outcomes. So what we were really excited about doing this is kind of shifting into not only the kinds of projects that might be funded or the kinds of initiatives that might be funded, but also how they're going to be funded, how actually the practice and strategies for funding change. Are there different financial tools? Are there ways in which we can shift from project funding to portfolio funding to funding networks and whole ecosystems of actors to create change? And really also leaning into some of what it means to understand the life cycle of change. At what point we want to intervene? How do we understand change happening? And therefore, what kind of funding, what kind of support is needed by the change actors in order to make the most impact? And so this was really a module that was all around designing strategies for systems change, but specifically from this perspective of what is the future of money and what is the power that that wields to create change in itself, and funders really learning to be change agents, to be system changers, not just the funders of systems change. So it's also this inner work that helps kind of shift the posture and stance and become an actor in the system. And then we had a module that was more around, as I mentioned up front, learning and impact. And actually, to start off with, we were calling it learning and health. And we were trying to think about what it means to work towards healthy systems, not just monitor the kind of the KPIs or the indicators that we might have set up at the beginning of a project. And how do we really understand that if we're in a dynamic and complex world, we're more in a learning stance than we are in a sort of monitoring stance for this sort of work. And that this actually has a lot of implications for both funders and grantees and the conversations between them, and how we might capture the sort of less visible and tangible aspects of change, how we might think about, of course, setting up KPIs, of course, trying to understand the direction that we want to take and measuring progress along that direction. And then also really staying open to other learning, to other kind of signals of change, and tracking and making sense of perhaps even new indicators that need to come up in a very collective way. And this was also a module where we had a lot of input from foundations who are trying to test this, who are really thinking about how they can shift their own approach, how they can co-design learning approaches with the organizations they're working with to create systems change. And we also had some really wonderful provocations in here from evaluators taking very new and much more systems informed approaches, and people who are really thinking about what does it mean to lean into a new worldview of healthy systems rather than achieving what we were set out to do. So really kind of working on how we tell stories, how we bring to the forth sort of narratives of change as opposed to just the quantitative side of learning and impact. So that's really what we got to by the end of our 3 modules. And we had about 15 different organizations join for these. Some of them were grant funders, fairly large, fairly small organizations. Some of them were public sector funders, some of them were impact investors. And we have a peer learning experience across that whole piece so that we can really kind of listen to and find the collective inquiry questions with people during the piece. And what we wanted to do today is sort of share with you and just have a discussion with a couple of these sort of inquiry questions that came out of our first pilot, but that we still see as really live questions as we go forwards. So I wonder whether we might have a little bit of a tech check. Serena, did you want to tell us a little bit about how this is going to work for this next bit of the session?
Sure. So as you can see on the screen, I have 3 discussion questions listed from our modules. Each of these breakout rooms will be moderated by one person from the School of Systems Change to help facilitate the discussion. We'll also be capturing notes on a Miro board. So rather than have you jump in the Miro board, we'll be on the behind the scenes with that. And in a moment's time, I'm going to be opening the breakout rooms for you as participants to opt into one of the groups. So from here, you can scan through the questions and choose one that is most pertinent to where you are or and your organization are in your learning journey, and like to jump into a discussion that's about 10 to 12 minutes. It'll be kind of a short deep dive into the broader question, and then we will be coming back into plenary for a broader discussion around insights across the 3 discussions. Can I field any questions or welcome any questions over chat?
Yeah, could you explain a little bit more about these groups? That they probably mean a lot more to you guys since you're really deep into this.
Sure, maybe I can answer that question so that we can go in. Thanks for that. So I guess these are questions that came up from a group of funders. So I recognize that in this group, there might be funders and there might also be people who are not funders, but who are more widely interested in this session. And that's absolutely fine, because we know that this is kind of co-created, this work of what the role of funding is with systems change. So the first one is really kind of pulling off this question about, we know that system change needs to happen, and there's this insight in the field that in order for that to happen, there needs to be a shift of funding towards systems change work. But we don't know exactly really what the role is, what that shift is going to be. So it's trying to imagine how we can shift funding towards systems change work, and at the same time that can be a change intervention in itself, and really thinking about, therefore, what are the ways we need to reimagine power dynamics or decision making, or like how do we actually shift the role of funding and not just shift the dollars or the pounds or the euros or whatever we want to call it towards this work, right? So it's recognizing that the way that funding is set up is part of the problem, and we need to shift that too. The second group is really about thinking about not just systems change as a way of, well, again, not thinking about systems change as an outcome, but thinking about it as a process. It's not something that we can do without changing the ways that we organize. And so this question is more about how do we need to support enabling conditions and the ways that we need to organize together as different actors in order to create systemic change. Okay, so there's something that's more about investing in or funding some kind of enabling conditions or infrastructure in order to be able to do systems change work. And then the third group is really more around this shift that I just mentioned from monitoring or evaluation as a way of proving that we've done the right thing. I'm amplifying that a little bit more, to really fostering a learning culture. And what does that mean? And what does that mean for us as organizations? And in particular, what does it mean in the funding world to foster learning and strive for health, rather than thinking about just making sure the boxes are ticked or that the KPIs are right, or that, you know, we've done what we've said we would. So that's a little bit more about those questions. And maybe just also, I am going to moderate group 3. So I've been involved with this program, and maybe just the other 2 facilitators, do you want to just say hi and say who's doing what?
Hi, I'm Rodrigo, and I will be facilitating group 1.
Hi, I'm Serena, and I'll be facilitating group 2, creating conditions and infrastructure. So at this point, I will be opening the breakout rooms. It will allow you to choose the breakout room to jump into. Our facilitators will be also going into the room with you. If you don't have an updated Zoom application and would like to be placed into a room, you're welcome to put that into chat, and then I will manually place you into whichever group you've indicated. So I'm going to open the rooms now. And if you encounter any issues, please do let me know. For group 2, I will be joining you in a moment or 2 just to make sure that everyone lands in the right breakout room. Hi, for those who are just joining us, if you haven't heard, we'll be jumping into the breakout room. We have moderators in each one of them. I have the screen open with the questions, and you are welcome to jump right in. Our moderator will also help with a little bit of clarification to the question if you've just joined us in the session. And Lisa and Alyssa, if there is a particular group that you'd like to join, please do join. If you are okay just hanging out in the plenary, you're more than welcome to do that as well. Okay, I apologize. I'll be jumping into group 2, but do ping me as host if there's anything I can help with.
Welcome back, everyone. That felt like a very short time to our group, as it always does in these Zoom rooms. Everyone goes, oh, we've only got a minute left. So we had a very rich discussion, and we'd like to invite each of the groups to maybe just feedback a key insight or a really kind of generative question that you might have around the subjects that we touched on. And I wonder whether we might just go in the order of the groups for expediency. So if you want to start up for us, and please do feel free to unmute and jump in, everyone. We're fairly small groups, so we'd like this to be a sort of participatory session.
Great, thanks, Laura. And Bobby and I, we had a really good conversation. We had a cozy group, just the 2 of us essentially. And yes, Bobby, please come and add. I'm just going to quickly kind of summarize some of the questions. Just a reminder, what was our question is, how might we reimagine the role of funding when creating systems change? So around that conversation, some of the stuff and insights that were coming is, one insight was like funding is not maximize upstream opportunity, which means something about by default psychologically we go to try to cure the symptom rather than prevention. So kind of even like the focus and the reaction tends to go and almost distract us to rather than go to the root and the radical part of changing stuff, we tend to be distracted somewhere else. Share something that in the particular, the context was a lot about because of the work from Bobby is around risk mitigation in multiple relationships to different stakeholders, for particularly on fires. So we're talking about helping, how you help different organizations that they might have a competitive, standard. Like the example was there, for instance, think about Twitter, Snapchat, and Facebook, that they obviously have a part where they compete, but they might have a shared risk that they could co-create and come to invest on that to create systemic change in that particular risk that they're sharing, but they're not coming enough to do that. There are not enough spaces for them to understand and see it. And one of the things or questions and this point that we're seeing is just that there is a need for bridge between organizations to really help them to see, and industries to see the coming together to collaborate. For example, there was an example there about water and fire people coming together. They haven't been together for a long time to talk about fire mitigation. And then also one thing that we share, it was a little bit of once you really go into the reimagine the funding model, how that impacts your governance model. For instance, the governance model means that sometimes people that are actually impacted by the big challenges that the organization is trying to change are not necessarily represented in the in an equity level into the board, etc. Bobby, what else would you like to add?
Oh, I thought everything you said is terrific. I think the part that I would just add is that if you see systems change around a social innovation portfolio with the scope of collective challenge, then if the stakeholders are never in a room together where all the people who own the risk are there because they've sold it through insurance, reinsurance, insurance-linked securities, they've broken their risk down into so many categories that are siloed: multi-hazard peril, health insurance, life insurance, crop yield insurance, business interruption insurance, et cetera, that no one can get their mind into the field of view that allows them to regain and reclaim agency. So the question of how do we give the connectivity of the financial layer of consequentiality, how all of these are actually convergent benefits that are achieved through an integrated strategy, how do we use that to create, how to weave the community together into collaboration based on that shared interest and shared value. So I think that's part of what we were thinking through, and we were working on related. So delighted to be in this dialogue.
Thanks so much. Well, it sounds like a really generative conversation. Serena, I wondered whether you wanted to feedback a little bit around what you were talking about in group 2 for us.
Yeah, so in group 2, we were talking about how might we create conditions and infrastructure for systems change with bringing in both sides of the funding relationship, so funders and grantees, and having a group that represented both. We named here that there is, we saw a gap within systemic theories of change among those seeking funding for funders who are looking to work more systemically and fund more systemically, as well as the flip side of having grantees who have a systemic theory of change, but also having almost like another set of plans with that a shorter delivery time that have highlight the social returns, tying it to KPIs that can be delivered upon in a few years. Some of the discrepancies can be rooted in this appetite for risk and how funding systems change is still feeling relatively risky over a long period of time, the uncertainty around the KPIs and metrics to track, as well as have prioritizing immediate need, the immediate social return on investment, needing deliverables at the end of projects. And where we also similarly landed, as with group one, is how can we meet halfway between these two different viewpoints? How can we co-create a design space that really leverages the viewpoints of funders and grantees to cultivate this kind of discussion around how we would intentionally shift the funding cycle, the funding process, so that it can lend toward more systemic investments. And one thing we layered upon that is also the distribution of power and decision making in that relationship and in those discussions, that funders, having decision making over resource allocation and the length of time to be doing funding, also then influence how we can create a very collaborative conversation around this.
Is there anyone else from group two who wants to just add their voice to what Serena did? A lovely summary there.
Well, I just wanted to add that we have the structure in place. It's called Web3, the blockchain, and it's something that everybody's shifting over into. It's a solution. It's greener than anything we have already, and that's all I wanted.
Thank you. Always good to hear references to existing innovations and how we can shift something that we might see being used in food supply chains and think about how that also might revolutionize some of these challenges that we're talking about. Any other voices before I do a quick sum up of our group? Okay, well, we had a really generative conversation around the question of how we can foster a learning culture. And I guess one of the first insights from our session was that we were saying, well, a learning culture with whom, who's learning culture? And we're already realizing how much layering there is there. There's the learning that's going on as individual organizations working on the ground, then there's learning that collectives do, and we've already heard a little bit about how there's that need to bring people together, but often there are hubs or collaboratives or sort of sector level collaborations, and there's learning going on there, and then also the funder is doing their own learning. And so there was this question about, well, where is the level of the culture? And what came out of that is also this idea that if we're thinking about systems change learning, then actually we need to be learning not in these silos, but really about the system and how on earth do we do that? That's a question that we're all holding. How do we really together learn how to understand how a system's changing, how healthy it's becoming, how it's being strengthened, how we can really kind of sit and learn at the level of the system as opposed to everyone kind of doing it in their own way. And one of the things that came out really strongly there is this idea of having sort of really strong intentional values around the work that we're doing, and making sure therefore that it's as much about how we do this work as it is about the work that we're doing. And that was something that came out quite strongly in this conversation, and also recognizing that it's about different ways of doing and being, and that it's about recognizing also cultural differences that there might be there across funders sitting in one place of the world and maybe the change we're looking for sitting somewhere else, and asking ourselves therefore, how do we harvest more stories? How do we become more qualitative in the work that we're doing? How do we measure the effects of a network, even including Catalyst 2030? It's something that takes time, it's weaving, it's intangible, it doesn't necessarily have KPIs with it, but we understand that systems change is also a bit like that, a little bit untangible. And then really, how do we also put the emphasis less on just monitoring what's going on, and more about how are both the initiatives becoming more sustainable in the sense of, you know, being able to continue to do the work and the systems changing work longer term, but also for outcomes that will work for people and planet. And then we had a few sort of sets of experience in here, what this means in terms of process. So the idea of having regular review cycles, quarterly reviews, and then kind of yearly adaptations against that. So how we can not be so strict and long in our timelines, for example, and then being really strong on intentions was something that came up in our group. But I'd love to invite any other voices to add to this, hear your views and kind of the key insights that you had in our discussion.
One thought that occurs to me across all the questions is that it's not about systems change, at least for our foundation. Systems change is a method. It's a way of getting somewhere. And so in terms of what we're measuring and how we figure out if something's succeeding, we know what success looks like. We have a definition of that. We share that in common with the folks we're funding. We don't expect each one of those organizations to do the whole thing. We expect them to do their part. But I find it much easier to have the discussion about systems change in the context of saying, this is the goal, this is the impact we're trying to reach. Therefore, let's measure against that, as opposed to just sort of trying to measure systems change for systems change's sake.
Thank you, Luis. Is either of our other group want to bring a voice in here? Or also just inviting anyone. Yeah, come on in. Thank you, Rachel.
Example, which I thought was really good around Luis has said, is a process and in different levels. So the governance organization, what is the measure of governance? And maybe what I would say is, you know, some of the grant aspects around governance, because I think for the you know, for the grantee, then that capacity aspect.
Oh, you're breaking up a little bit, Rachel.
Goes all the way. Okay, so I was just saying that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can right now.
Hello, I'll type it out. Can you hear me
Oh,
now?
thanks, Rachel.
Sorry, my network is.
No worries.
Yeah, so I was just saying about
snippets,
governance. Yes, the aspect of governance in terms of system change really plays a very critical role. The governance of the, you know, is, yes, the aspect of the awardee, whoever is being funded, and even then their capacity to roll out every other system change. So I just thought that was it was pointed out by one of the group members, and I thought that is so critical, the aspect of governance, of the organizational governance. And over and beyond that, the actual, you know, thinking around sustainability of whatever it is that they are rolling out. Thank you, over.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And we heard you well for that second half. So we've got a few minutes left, and Luis already started us in this direction. Is there anyone who wants to come in and share either an insight or a pattern that they're seeing across the piece here, across these three groups? Anything that stood out for you or that you want to invite into the conversation? So there's an interesting
Laura, can I ask a
invitation.
question?
Sure, go for it, Louis. I just wanted
Amongst
to
the
recognize
amongst the cohort of funders in your in the courses you ran, Was there a common understanding of systems change, and was there a common approach? As I said, Osprey approaches this from the perspective of systems change on the ground in the countries and districts where we're supporting activities, because we see that as a way to deliver sustainable services in the areas that matter to us. That's what we think about systems change. But as I listen to a bunch of the comments here, I think there are wildly different ideas about what systems change means. And I'm wondering if out of that cohort of funders that you worked with for the initial thing, did you come up with different baskets of sort of typologies of what funders think of as systems change? What does this term mean to different funders?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it reminds me of a piece of work we did back in 2018 of kind of as part of the setup of the Illuminate network, thinking about pooling all of our different definitions of systems change at the beginning of that. And I have a nice visual that we could share. I think we didn't get into this too much, but some of what I was seeing is that there's definitely a big difference in organizations that are doing funding place-based systems change. There's kind of one category of really, place-based systems change, and then there are different funders who are working on that, and then there are others who are more thinking about what it means to actually intervene in an international, or even what they might say global system or theme or issue or challenge. We said, we had funders around mental health, for example, but who were really trying to think about how almost we're thinking about it as a species, like what does it mean as humans to be well? And so I would say that was a distinction, and certainly brought up, and I'm hearing that, the patterns already in the conversation here around, both how we understand the system and how we might see it changing is very different if you're looking at a kind of place-based approach as opposed to if you're looking at a sort of more thematic approach, and also that therefore the governance question that we're hearing popping up here as well, is also very different. The people that you might want to involve, the organizations that you might want to involve, and how that operates is also quite different. So that would be one distinction I would see, but I'd also invite, Serena, you were in this group with me. Did you have a different view on how that was being defined?
Yeah, I do think it depends on the level of where their work lies. I think even from this discussion, how we saw systems change really depended on what role you are. And if as a funder, you also saw systems change in collaboration with your grantees and thinking that they are the delivery provider. And so they must also be really grounded in their understanding of systems change in order for the whole system to shift. Those acting also need to understand what role they're playing. Or if you're a funder who is utilizing your resources and thinking resource allocation as the method of systems change. And so there's a different perspective of how, who's doing the doing part of it. And that has really surfaced even in our conversation today.
Yeah, thank you. So we're coming to the end of our time together, and we want to make sure that we've just got a couple of minutes to maybe make an invitation to continue this conversation. I know that there are some really great other sessions this week, so that have been kind of curated around the topic of systems change, and also some more specifically on funding. So, do look out for that as part of the whole Catalyst week. There are some really great pieces there. And then Serena, shall I hand over to you just to kind of wrap us up with a few other places to continue this conversation?
To me.
Yeah, sorry.
No worries. So just to close out, thank you very much for joining us. We really want to, just a couple of invitations. The first one is we welcome you to share your email in the chat. And if you want to stay updated with more funder learning, this was just a little bit of a taster, and kind of, if you are living like me, I wanted more, and I wanted more time to, go deeper with all of you in these conversations. We are only scratching the surface right now. So if you want to stay in tune with more opportunities like this, please share your email. We have an upcoming Funder Practitioner Fishbowl event, which is going to be Thursday, June 2nd. We are going to share in a second, Serena, the information there on the chat, so you can join us. The session will be to hear how funders have started their learning journeys around systems change and share their questions and learn from each other. So it's an opportunity for that. And then we are also, for those ones that are looking for in-person funder training, we're going to be back in person, which we're really looking forward after couple of years of just online. So around systems change, we will be announcing an in-person date for mid-autumn on the course page that we have there. And also, we really invited you to reach out to us if you have any inquiries around systems change learning. Thank you. Like any of us, we will be very happy to connect. The email also will be in the chat message from Serena. Yeah, that's the final message. Thank you very much for joining us. And as Laura said, keep an eye out. Looks like loads of wonderful sessions all over there for Catalyst 2030. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day, morning, whatever you are in the world right now.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.